And joining us for this hour is Mark Prenderga. He's an author. He's got a book out, The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky and the Rush to Judgment. And it is germane to what is going on today with this witch hunt hysteria going on about sexual abuse allegations. And again, to clarify, some of these allegations are true, but some of them are not. And we need to be very, very careful that we don't destroy an innocent person's life. So, Mark, thank you for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Well, so tell us a little bit about the book and how it came about and who Jerry Sandusky was.
Well, first, I think everybody knows who Jerry Sandusky was, who's been alive for the last few years. He was a defensive coordinator for Penn State football team. He retired in 1999, very honored, whatever. He started a program called The Second Mile to help troubled youth, both boys and girls. And he was involved with helping with that program personally. And he was then accused of using The Second Mile sort of as a candy store to molest these children, and many, many accusers have come forward, something like 33 of them, and they have paid out. He was found guilty in a trial in 2012. He's in prison for the rest of his life unless some miracle happens, and they have paid over $100 million to basically anyone who has come forward to accuse him. And I think most people are quite sure that he's guilty because an assistant coach named Mike McQuarrie allegedly saw him abusing a child in the shower in 2001. However, it turns out that probably none of this is true, and he is an innocent man in prison. And I'm grateful to you for letting me speak about it, because so far there's been pretty much of a blackball of this information in the mass media. They've got their abuse narrative, and they're not interested in hearing alternate facts. You asked me how I got onto this case, and I would urge people to look at my website. It's called just markpendergrast.com, and that's spelled Pendergrast. You'll see I've written 14 books. Most of them have been very well reviewed in places like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. This one hasn't been reviewed anywhere yet because, as I say, it's a difficult thing to get out. One of the books that I wrote is called Memory Warp, and it also just came out. And so I hope we can talk about it too. It's called Memory Warp: How the Myth of Repressed Memory Arose and Refuses to Die. So I had written a book about this 20 years ago.
I remember reading it.
Called Victims of Memory. You read Victims of Memory?
Yeah, I remember that, because it was a big issue again during the 1990s when people who were all of a sudden being told, yeah, you experienced this, you don't remember it because you've got a repressed memory, but trust us, this actually happened to you.
That's right. So it became a real epidemic in the late 1980s and during most of the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And most people think that it went away because memory scientists have basically demolished this idea. My book demolished this idea. And there were many lawsuits also against therapists who led people into believing these terrible things that turned out not to be true. So I think most people think that it went away, this kind of therapy, but it has not gone away, which is why I wrote Memory Warp. It's coming back in full measure. The new generation of millennials don't remember any of this and don't know any of it. And most of the therapists who did it still believe in this misguided idea that people repress memories of traumatic abuse. The fact of the matter is, we remember very well some things, and what we remember the best are the awful things that happen to us. And if you think about this, I think you'll know that's true. The worst things that happen to you are the ones that make the most impression. And that makes sense in terms of evolution because, it behooves you to remember them so you can avoid the bad stuff. It's not that you repress it. So I wrote a book about human memory and suggestibility, and that's what memory warp is, and warning that it's coming back. And one of the evidences that it's coming back is the Jerry Sandusky case. Now, I've got to give credit to a woman named Glenna Kirker who contacted me in 2013 out of the blue by email. And if anyone wants to email me, they can do the same thing she did. Go to my website, markpendergrass.com, and when you hit contact, it emails me directly, and I answer everybody. So she emailed me, and she said, have you looked at the Jerry Sandusky case because it's full of repressed memory? And I said, really? Are you sure about this? Because, everybody knows he's guilty, and that guy saw him in the shower. And she wrote back, and she said, yeah, you need to go back and read the trial transcript, and you need to look very carefully at the evidence in this case, because repressed memory therapy was involved, although it was sort of hidden. And Mike McQuarrie did not witness anything. He heard slapping sounds in the shower, and it turns out that it was a young man named Alan Myers, and they were snapping towels at each other. So I'm not going to convince anybody through this newscast, I'm sure. So I would urge you to read the book. It's about 350 pages of text, lots and lots of endnotes. So it's about a 400-page book. The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky and the Rush to Judgment. It's extremely well documented, and I'm pleased that on Amazon it's received lots and lots of positive reviews, even if I can't get any reviews in the media. But I'll be glad to talk to you in whatever detail I can about it, and maybe by the end of the interview people will think that maybe there's more to this case than what we've been told.
Well, I remember that whole firestorm over the McMartin preschool, and it kicked off this thing about satanic ritual abuse of small children, and it just flashed up all over the nation, and there were accusations, lives were destroyed, preschools were shut down. And in the end, the FBI came on out and said, we've investigated every single one of these allegations, and we did not actually find a single incident of satanic ritual abuse of children. It just caught the public's imagination, and they went with it. And in terms of the false memory therapist, it's well known people can be open to suggestion and convinced that they've actually seen or heard something that they didn't. Hypnotists do it all the time. So it's part of that whole continuum. And you do need to be very, very careful. And it's sort of a conventional wisdom among people who work in the court system that human witnesses are very unreliable because they're constantly going over and over in their head what they thought they saw or heard, and in their effort to try and clarify it, they may actually convince themselves of things that didn't really happen. And there's not a new phenomenon here, because if you go back and you look at the stage play, later the movie, 12 Angry Men, there's that one person who obviously, without the glasses, couldn't see the crime being committed, yet was convinced that she recognized the accused as the perpetrator. That's a very real phenomenon.
Well, Mike, you are very well educated on this subject. I'm delighted. Yeah, if people read Memory Warp, there's a chapter on these daycare cases, which began with McMartin in 1983. There were over 100 of them, and most of them involve preschoolers, and you can get a 3 or 4-year-old to say pretty much anything, especially if you're absolutely sure that they were abused. And they said the most outlandish things about how they were taken up in hot air balloons and abused in satanic cults, as you said. And you're right, the FBI investigated them, and, there were no satanic abuse cults where people were being forced to eat and kill and eat babies and all these horrible things they came up with. Now, that was only one chapter in Memory Warp. Most of the book is about adults going to therapy And, you know, automatically, if you're going for counseling of any kind, you're in a vulnerable stage in your life where you're searching for answers to why you're unhappy in one form or another, whether you're depressed or have an anxiety disorder or an eating disorder. You're looking for some sort of reason why you had it and how you can get over it. And if you go to the wrong type of therapist, they will tell you that they will ask you, were you sexually abused as a child? And if you say no, they'll say, well, we suspect you were and that you repressed the memory. And I've had lots of people come in with exactly the same symptoms that you have. And the only way you're going to feel better is to remember some horrible thing that happened to you. So I think most people listening to this would probably think, you know, I would never be conned into such a thing. I wouldn't fall for that. But unless you'd listened to a show like this and were forewarned, I can assure you that you might very easily fall for it. Because what happens is people say, well, no, I wasn't sexually abused as a child. That's ridiculous. And the therapist says, well, you know, that's what lots of people have told me. But the fact is you will remember it if it happened to you. And the only way you're going to get better is to remember it. And so you say, well, you know, that's ridiculous. But how would it happen? How would I remember it? And they'll say, well, you know, I could hypnotize you. And you say, oh, no, I'm afraid of hypnosis. I don't want to do that. Say, well, okay, you might dream about it. We won't push for it. We won't do anything invasive. But if you dream about it, it would prove that it happened. Or you might have a body memory. Your body remembers what the mind forgets. So if you have some pain in your behind, maybe it means you were sodomized as a child, or, you know, if your arm hurts, maybe somebody twisted your arm. Or maybe you'll have a flashback, a kind of a panic attack to this, and you'll see it in your mind. And often these memories come back in fragments, so you'll just see little parts of it. Well, all of this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people will then many people will obsess over it and think, could this possibly be true? Then they will have a dream about it.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that it's true. Or they will have a panic attack. And many, many people do have panic attacks, which doesn't mean that anything happened to you. It means that you were worried about it and you've freaked yourself out. And the terrible thing about this kind of therapy is that it doesn't make people better. In general, it usually makes them much, much worse. In fact, the therapist will tell them that you have to get worse before you get better. Well, many of them get much, much worse, attempt suicide, lose their jobs, lose their careers, freak out, because often they come to believe that it was their parents, their father or their mother, who did this to them, or their grandparents, or someone who was a caretaker when they were a child. And if you can imagine what that would do to somebody, to think that the person that was supposed to love them, that they had trusted, that was hugely meaningful in their life, was in reality this evil monster, it is very difficult to live with. So, you know, I have heard from people about this type of therapy now for over 2 decades. And it is coming back, and people need to be forewarned about it. So I'm very proud of Memory Warp, and I hope that people will read it. But I'm even more proud right now of The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky, and The Rush to Judgment, because there's a man who is sitting in prison for the rest of his life whom I'm convinced is entirely innocent. And this case has cost probably over $1 billion. That's with a B, if you count all the lawyers who've been paid and all of the as I said, $100 million paid to the alleged victims. And it's an appalling case that nobody wants to look at. So I'm very happy you're willing to take a look at it, and we can talk about it in some detail.
Well, you know, there's no question that there are serious miscarriages of justice in our history, and it's also true that government never wants to admit to it. The media won't cover it. Leonard Peltier, comes to mind. James Earl Ray is another. Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Once the government has said this person is guilty, they don't want to turn around and say we were wrong, because it undermines public trust in the justice system. But in listening to
I don't know about some of the cases you just talked about in detail. So I would have to look at them. One of the things that I definitely have vowed in this is not to jump to conclusions about guilt or innocence in any of these cases. And to look at them. It seems fairly, you mentioned the hysteria over sexual harassment right now. Mm-hmm. And it clearly has reached that proportion. On the other hand, it started with Harvey Weinstein, who, from what I have read and from what I see, clearly did these things. And many, as you pointed out, of the people who have been pilloried probably did do these things. On the other hand, I wrote an article I live in Vermont. I wrote in a local publication called the Vermont Digger about the Garrison Keillor case, and that seems completely insane to me. From everything we know, the big thing he did was to pat somebody on the back, and his hand went under their T-shirt. So that's insane. So a lot of these hysteria cases, they will take almost anything as being sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. So, at any rate, I'm rambling a bit, but you sound like you know a lot about this.
As I mentioned earlier in the show, these things can be a matter of fashion, and one person's flirtation can be somebody else's sexual assault. But one of the problems we have with the liberal establishment in this country right now is they're trying to convince everybody to be offended by everything. And as I like to tell people, when I was working in Europe on film projects in the 1980s, the women who worked at those companies, they expected flirtation. And if they didn't get it, you were going to find that your work wasn't getting done. So these are driven by fashion. But in the current climate where everybody is triggered by everything, we're getting into this idea where the allegation alone should be enough to destroy a life, and that is absolutely wrong. Yes, Weinstein did what he did for the most part. I worked in the film industry for a lot of years, and I got to see a lot of that. But again, we have to be very careful, because there are some innocent people like Judge Roy Moore, where it's come on out that the allegations were just ginned up out of thin air, a forged yearbook entry.
Oh, is that right? That's the first I've heard of that. I had assumed that he probably did do this. That's not true, huh?
No, it isn't. Beverly Nelson has now admitted that she wrote part of that yearbook entry that Gloria Allred was using to try and smear him in this Alabama election. So we do need to be very, very careful. One thing that occurs to me when you're talking about these regressive or repressed memory therapy, it almost reminds me a lot of the Scientologists with their e-meter, where they're convincing you that you lived all these past lives and you did all this stuff with Xenu, and it's almost like a cult. And we know that modern psychology, psychiatry, isn't really a science. There's no machine that you can put on somebody's forehead that says manic, depressive, schizoid, or whatever. It's always a subjective opinion of the practitioner, most of whom have a bias to keep you in the therapy experience for as long as they possibly can to maximize their fees.
Well, Mike, you've said a bunch of things I'd like to react to. Okay. And I agree with much of it, but not necessarily all of it. I have to reveal something to you. I am a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, or at least I used to call myself that. Now I don't call myself either liberal or conservative. I call myself a skeptic and a thinker.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break here. I'm sorry to cut you off, Mark, but we're going to have to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're talking with Mark Prendergast. He's author of a whole bunch of books. The one we're talking about now is The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky. And, Mark, I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up. Our commercial breaks are spaced rather unevenly, so don't let that catch you by surprise. And if it's okay with you, we have a caller waiting on the line who'd like to talk to you.
Okay. Before you do your caller, I want to just say, I was listening to your ads. I wrote a book called Inside the Outbreaks, which is a history of the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is part of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And I completely object to them saying that vaccines are evil and terrible. They saved many, many lives. So I just need to throw that in. And, you know, all this paranoia over global government. I mean, you and I could have a big, you know, let's stick to the subject of repressed memories and the Sandusky case, and I'm fine.
Okay, well then let's take a phone call here. We're talking to Chris in St. Petersburg. Chris, aloha. Do you have a question for our guest?
Yes. I'm wondering, do you feel, Mark, that there is no such thing as repressed memories, that it doesn't exist?
Yeah, pretty much, yes. Freud came up with this notion in 1895 that terrible trauma, usually sexual abuse of children, is so awful that you completely forget it. Freud forced his clients into, quote, remembering this sort of thing, and I do hope you'll pick up Memory Warp and read. There's a chapter in it called A Brief History talking about Freud, and then it was sort of resuscitated by mostly feminist therapists in the late 1980s, and you know, about 80% of the American public believes in this, so it's quite common, but there's absolutely no science behind it. I did find a few cases of people who forgot real sex abuse and then remembered it later, but they weren't, it wasn't like, you know, years of being raped. It was like usually being fondled or somebody exposed themselves to you. And I came to realize that most of these weren't traumatic at the time. They were confusing. I'm not trying to forgive these actions. They're not okay. But they weren't perceived as horrible events, and they just forgot them, and then something reminded them of them, and they remembered it. But that's very, very different from the cases of, you know, people being molested for years at a time and threatened and then suddenly remembering it, supposedly. So well, no, I don't believe in that.
Single events are not going to really stick in your consciousness. And when this whole situation about Weinstein came on up, when I was working in the film industry, there were two occasions when a couple of gay stars hit on me. And at the time, I didn't think it was a big deal. And so I'd kind of forgotten about it, but it wasn't traumatic. But then when this whole thing came on up, I said, yeah, this stuff does go on. And actually, I was a little flattered at the time. But that's another story entirely.
Anyway, it's not a matter of repressing it. It's a matter of sort of, you know, just not thinking about it for a while.
Well, I would like to add that my two nephews, over 2 weeks of them having been taken by my brother, experienced a lot of abuse, and now they don't remember it. They had cigarette burns all over their legs before a court hearing at which they appeared, and my brother was stripped of any custody. But I believe myself that meditation can solve all problems. And also my mother, in a head-on collision that made her a paraplegic, an oil truck hit her that my late mother became a paraplegic from, and others saw the head-on collision. She doesn't remember anything except for the oil truck heading towards her over the hill.
Well, let me comment on that. With your mother, which I'm very sorry to hear that happened to her. That has nothing to do with repressed memories. That has to do with organic brain damage, and that happens very frequently. That if somebody has a terrible shock to their brain, then they're not going to remember it. In terms of the children who were burned by cigarettes and don't remember it, that's very hard to believe. I would have to look at that case specifically.
Okay, well, Chris,
you know, I would like them to do the same in order to integrate them. But I understand. I agree with you that integrating false memories, I feel, can be traumatizing. But then again, them integrating correct memories would be therapeutic. And I suggest that folks test their memories in order to integrate them, in order to try to validate them with other people. And this existence is much more intricate than anyone knows, as shown by the Mandela effect. That's another topic, I feel, but it all does tie together. And I know I agree that a hypnotherapist can ask leading questions and so the patient can try to be obliging to that hypnotherapist by answering those leading questions with fabricated false memories. And you know, instead of trying to convince someone that they've been hypnotized by showing them that
we got to take another break. I'm sorry, Chris. We got to take another break for commercials. We'll be back with another phone call after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're talking with Mark Prenderga, who's the author of The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky. And we're going to get back to that here very, very quickly. But I wanted to make a point. One area where the so-called repressed memory therapists may be a little bit less than honest with their clients is you need to remember there's a difference between a memory that's repressed and one that is merely lost. And if you are my age, and if you are, I feel sorry for you, you've probably already had this experience where some smell, some picture, some image will all of a sudden pop back something you haven't thought about for a lot of years. And it's not traumatic and it's not evil. I had one where somebody fixed some iced tea and they did it in a specific way that reminded me of my mother fixing iced tea when I was like 2. Okay, that's not a repressed memory. It's a misplaced memory, and that's a very real phenomenon. Now, we're going to take one more phone call, then we're going to close the phone lines because I want to give the rest of the show to Mark here. So, James in Ohio, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I agree that leading the witness and hypnosis are not the best way to deal with victims of abuse. However, I want to make 2 points and get your guest's response to them. Number one, Dr. Michael Persinger, who writes papers about accessing every human brain on the planet through some kind of electromagnetic means, sits on the board of something called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And 2 members, Ralph Underwager and his wife, gave an interview with a Dutch pedophile publication, Prenderga, in which they said that love between adults and children is God's love. And they said they were going to kick them. They said they were going to kick them off board. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation gives expert testimony in cases of pedophiles to discredit the child witnesses, but they said they were going to kick them off the board, and they never did. Number 2, Colonel Michael Aquino, who administrated over the Presidio in San Francisco, was also head of the Temple of Set, and all these kids in the daycare center started showing up with a wide array of STDs, and nobody ever got in any trouble. Nobody even got fired for it. So I wanted your response on those.
Hi. So you're going to have to read my book, read Memory Warp, and then I think you can get back to me. But in terms of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, I did write about the Underwagers about Ralph Underwager and that horrible interview they gave that you're absolutely right about in Victims of Memory. That was a long, long time ago. But I will tell you that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is in general founded on decent science. Elizabeth Loftus, who is someone that I completely respect and who wrote nice comments about my Sandusky book and Memory Warp, and who is probably the premier memory scientist in the world, certainly on memory distortion. She's been on their board for a long time, too. And so I really urge you to rethink your vilification of the FMS Foundation. And in terms of the daycare cases, I haven't found any evidence whatsoever for satanic ritual abuse, so do take a look at that again, please. So thanks for calling in.
All right, well, we're going to let the we do have one more call, unfortunately, who was already waiting. So, she hung up. All right, the phone lines are closed. No more phone calls. I want to give Mark time to really get into what happened with Jerry Sandusky. So, Mark, give us the story as you know it.
Okay. Basically, a kid named Aaron Fisher, and we know his name quite well because not only did he testify in the trial, but he wrote a book with his therapist, Mike Gillum, and his mother, called Silent No More. And I would urge people to read that too, because it's extremely revealing. Without him and without his therapist, the case against Sandusky would never have happened. So when he was like 15 years old, he went with very vague allegations that his mother had encouraged, saying only that Sandusky had wrestled with him and had cracked his back afterwards while they both had their clothes on, which is true. But Gillum was sure that there was more to it. And he tells you in the book how he would guess what had happened. And for him, oral sex was sort of like the holy grail, and he kept going after this kid until he basically would nod his head and say, yes, that happened. He didn't actually have to say anything. This is absolutely terrible interviewing style and terrible therapy. He would just have the kid either say yes or no to something, and he made it very clear what he wanted him to hear. Mm-hmm. So that went on for like 3 years. That was the origin of this case. Then they discovered that in 1998, Sandusky had taken a shower with the kid. And let me just, and the kid, basically the mother had been upset about it. And so they interviewed the kid the next day, and they said, you know, did he do anything to you? No, he didn't do anything to him. But they were upset, so he said, okay, I won't shower with that kid anymore. So basically, then they got Mike McQueary, who had heard these slapping sounds 10 years before, and who then revised his memory and said, oh, I saw him moving his hips behind this boy in the shower, whereas in fact he had seen nothing in the shower. So they developed, basically the police went and interviewed 600 of these kids from the second mile, and they got 6 of them, 1%, to say that something had happened. Almost all of them, except one, said that nothing had happened when they were first spoken to. So it was only after they sort of went after them, they sent them to therapy, that a lot of this came out. Now, I will say that I was only able to interview one of the alleged victims in detail, and his name was Dustin Struble. And he was very open with me and said, yes, it was all from repressed memory. I said, well, what would you have told me in 2010 before you went to the police, before you went to therapy? What would you have told me about Jerry Sandusky? I said, well, I would have told you he was a mentor, that he was a good friend, that he had helped me in many, many ways. I said, would you have said he abused you? Oh, no, I didn't remember any of that then. So in his case, it's very clearly repressed memory, and he really, I liked him. You know, he was a nice young man, and he truly believes this, but it's misinformed, to say the least. So, you know, I'm not going to be able to go over this whole case. It's very complicated, and I would urge people to buy. It's $20. You know, or it's like $8 for a Kindle version of it. Go online and order the book and read it. It's amazing. You will not believe it. And the trial was a joke, held in the midst of media blitz and hysteria like you wouldn't believe. So there was no way he was going to get a fair trial. So he has decent lawyers now. His first lawyer was appalling. And I'm hoping that once it gets past Pennsylvania, that a federal judge will grant him a new trial, which he very, very obviously deserves.
Okay. Well, I certainly hope he gets it. And again, because of the fact that our justice system is far from perfect, it falls victim to ambitious prosecutors, corrupted judges. In fact, we're dealing with one of those out here involving the Kamehameha school system, where there's been this 3-year lawsuit actually lawsuits plural, against the Kamehameha schools and St. Francis Hospital by former students who accused a psychiatrist of sexual abuse decades ago. And the story just broke today that apparently the judge, the husband, is like lawyer for Kamehameha. And so the judge had to step down and recuse herself, and as soon as she did, Kamehameha did an about-face and admitted what had happened, and they're apologizing and so forth. So the court system is far from perfect, and we need to remember that. But these cases can get caught up in the media frenzy, and there can be a rush to judgment. And
let me ask you this.
Yeah.
In Hawaii, are the judges elected?
No, they're appointed.
Yeah. Well, see, in Pennsylvania, the judges are all elected. So what judge in Pennsylvania is going to grant Sandusky a new trial? None of them. None of them. Because, you know, what good is it going to do them to actually say, hey, there are problems with this case? So it's not going to happen. It's a political position. And it's political in terms of getting appointed, too, but it's not nearly as bad as getting elected. So in this case, democracy doesn't work very well because it means that nobody wants to be, quote, soft on sex offenders, et cetera. So he has no chance of getting a new trial, in my opinion, in Pennsylvania. But once they've exhausted all that, hopefully it will go to the federal system, and I hope they'll pay attention to it. But you're right. I mean, there are many, you know, the DNA exonerations have shown very clearly that particularly in emotionally volatile cases such as rape or murder, the prosecutors will get an idea of who did it, and they will not only pursue that, they will ignore any evidence that leads to somebody else, which is awful because many rapists and murderers have gone free because they've glommed onto the wrong person. And we know this, but we don't seem to learn from it. It just keeps happening over and over again.
Well, that's partly the system protecting itself. They don't want to admit they make these mistakes. The justice system needs the American people to believe that justice is blind, that it is fair, that it protects the innocent and it punishes the guilty, but the reality is quite the contrary. A lot of innocent people have been sent to jail. Remember when Frederick Whitehurst, the former head of the FBI crime lab, blew the whistle that the FBI was rigging lab results to favor prosecutors, and they had to go back and review hundreds of cases, and a lot of people got released from prison because they didn't deserve to be there. But the system doesn't want to have that image, and that's why they don't want to go back to any of these cases where there might have been a horrific miscarriage of justice. And the
media
terrible.
Doesn't want to do it either. The media, you know, you might have one or two movies or something on 60 Minutes showing one of these cases, and everybody says, "Oh, isn't this horrible?" But it's almost the norm. It's terrifying. If you are somebody who is accused, particularly of sexual abuse, in this country, you are going to be assumed to be guilty until proven innocent. Yeah. And that's, you know, not the way the system is supposed to work. And in most of these cases, there was no crime in the first place, so there's no DNA evidence that's going to clear anybody. They can't clear their name because there's no evidence because there was no crime. So it's appalling. Anyway, I very much hope your listeners will go and buy Memory Warp to find out exactly how memory really does work, which is pretty amazing in and of itself. What happened with this epidemic back in the 90s, why it's coming back. And I hope they'll read The Most Hated Man in America, the incredible saga of what happened to Jerry Sandusky, who, as far as I can figure out, was a decent man who had absolutely no sense of what was politically correct. He grew up in a recreation center that his father and mother ran. They didn't have their own shower. He took showers with men and kids all during the time he grew up. His father was sort of a hero of the town, and Jerry wanted to be like him and did help a lot of people. So it's a tragedy that this man is in prison, and I would urge people not only to read the book, but please post reviews on Amazon.com. The more reviews you have, the more people will pay attention to it. Same thing with Memory Warp, because the mass media isn't going to pay attention to this, and thank goodness you are, so I appreciate it.
Well, we've already posted links both to your website and to someplace where they can buy the book at whatreallyhappened.com. And I guess at this point we're going to go ahead and let you go unless you got something else you want to share with us.
No, my wife is, you can probably hear in the background, making dinner, so I better go.
Yes, it sounds delicious. Tell your wife it sounds delicious back there. We're going to let you go, and that was Mark Prenderga, again, the most hated man in America. And the reason I wanted to get him on here is because I do remember very clearly during the militant feminist movement of the 1990s how innocent men were being sent to prison, or at the very least having their lives ruined over bogus allegations. And I remember, I didn't realize this was the same guy. I remember reading about false memories back then, connected with McMartin and how, let's face it, little tiny kids, they want approval, whether it's from their parents or from the therapist. And if you put enough pressure on the kid to where they feel they're going to be approved of if they say certain things, they're going to say certain things. So again, in terms of the current context of politicians, some of these allegations are probably true. Some of the politicians have admitted they were true, but we have to take it on a case-by-case basis. We have an obligation to protect the innocent from these kind of pointless smear jobs, such as we saw directed against Judge Roy Moore here. All righty, moving on here. We're going to go ahead and open the phone lines if anybody wants to make a call. We're almost at the end of the show here. Story coming out of SorenDryer.com. Apparently, research is now showing that ADHD drugs decrease academic performance in children. Drugs like Ritalin and Adderall are actually causing the students taking these drugs to perform worse in school than if they weren't taking any medications at all. This is coming out of Princeton University, Cornell University, and the University of Toronto. And they all found that the administration of these drugs to children, which is supposed to help them focus in class, actually leaves students at a deficit and unable to focus and pay attention. But it makes money, and that's all that really counts. We'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Erica, welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program today. We're going to take one more phone call. Mateus in Canada, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. How's it going? In 2013, Whole Foods promised everybody that they were going to label GMO by 2018, and they milked this positive PR and advertising and word of mouth for 4 years until this year, the year before they have to come through with their promise, and then they just canceled it. And that's just a complete outrage. It's fraud. There's all this goodwill, all these people like me supporting the only place that's committed to GMO labeling. It's a total scam. And then it reminds me of your story about the cluster bombs, where we were supposed to have cluster bombs outlawed by 2019, and then now they just changed their mind.
Well, in the case of Whole Foods, they just changed owners, didn't they?
That's right.
Okay, well, I think the new owners just came in with a different idea. But you know what's really interesting? I think there's going to be GMO-free food in U.S. markets very soon, but it's going to be coming from Russia because Putin has declared Russia GMO-free. Apparently, they've really studied it and decided this is not something they want in their country. And they've gone so far that any farmer who agrees to produce only organic fruits and vegetables is getting free land. They're giving farmland away to anybody who will grow non-GMO organic fruits and vegetables. That's a good deal.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. The other half of my point, which is related to this, is that the reason that they are so bold to say they're going to ban cluster bombs and then at the last minute take it back is because of our reaction as a people. We just let them get away with it. And it's like, if you act like sheep, the wolves are going to come and feed on you, and all it takes for evil to prosper is for good men to do nothing. I mean, what is wrong with us? like they call us human resources, like we're livestock.
Yes, that's how they treat
us like we're livestock. So in a way, we're asking for this. They decide what we're going to
eat, what we can't eat. They decide what medicines we'll be forced to take, what medicines we're not allowed to take. Yeah, the government treats us all like we're livestock.
Yeah, it's totally ridiculous. And then just regarding last time I called in, I made a comment about karma, that many people believe in karma. I didn't hear the context of what I was agreeing to until later, that someone was saying that black people deserve their slavery. So I definitely do not agree with that, and I apologize for making it sound like I was endorsing that. I just generally believe what goes around comes around. In physics, every action has an opposite reaction. In philosophy, like in religion, it's live by the sword, died by the sword, do unto your others as you have done unto you. It's just general common sense, but and I also had forgotten what I was talking about last time I called in.
Well,
so
first of all, we're almost at the end of the show. We're at the end of the show, and I'm going to tell you, I disagree with the idea of karma. I don't think our future is immutably set for us to follow during our lives, that we can change the course of our life many, many times based on what we decide is important at any given moment. So I don't think there's such a thing as karma, and I don't think anybody deserves to be a slave, regardless of color. Unfortunately, we all are to that 1040 form, but I don't think...
Just make sure that your karma doesn't run over your dogma.
Yeah, I was going to say that one myself. Okay, there's the music. Thank you for the phone call. We're going to let you go.
This is William, hopefully your favorite videographer from 2X Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like, follow, or subscribe to us and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call.